Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, warming up, the Prime Minister hints at a net zero emissions target, days out from Joe Biden's International Climate Summit. Fears that a secret plan to avoid budget overrun on the National Disability Insurance Scheme could leave staff and participants worse off. And Australia Post announces it will no longer deliver perishable goods, cutting off a vital lifeline for remote producers. Joining me on the panel tonight, Professor of Food Sustainability at Charles Sturt University and former New South Wales Nationals Minister, NIALL. Great to see you again.
Hi, Ellen.
Economics consultant at Social Outcomes, a for-purpose enterprise, and the Climate Council, NICKI HUTLEY. Good to see you.
Hi, Ellen.
In Melbourne tonight, senior reporter at the Saturday paper, Rick Morton. Lovely to see you.
Thanks for having me.
And joining us shortly from Perth, President of People with a Disability Australia, Sam Conham. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. The Prime Minister is once again dallying with the prospect of Australia achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. He made the comments in a speech to the Business Council of Australia in Sydney last night.
Now, as a government, we are charting our own course to ensure Australia is well placed to prosper through the great energy transition of our time, consistent with the strong action on climate change, to ensure that we can get to that net zero economy, as I said, as quickly as possible and preferably by 2050, and I am increasing in confidence with the plan that we're developing to achieve that. We're not going to achieve net zero in the cafes, dinner parties and wine bars of our inner cities. It will not be achieved by taxing our industries that provide livelihoods for millions of Australians off the planet, as our political opponents sought to do when they got the chance. It will be achieved by the pioneering entrepreneurialism and innovation of Australia's industrial workhorses, farmers and scientists.
Those words have been interpreted as the clearest indication yet that the government is inching closer to embracing a target seen by many as the bare minimum to avoid catastrophic warming this century. Now, the timing is crucial here. In 2 days, Joe Biden convenes an international climate change summit. 40 world leaders have been invited and are expected to arrive bearing ambitious national emissions targets. And Scott Morrison will be keen not to arrive empty-handed, especially after Biden's climate chief, John Kerry, said the US was not yet on the same page as Australia when it comes to environmental policy. Can I start with you, Niall? Explain the politics, first of all, to me. The Prime Minister saying very loudly and stridently there, net zero emissions would not be achieved in the cafes, dinner parties and wine bars of our inner cities. But it's not the cabal in the wine bars calling for net zero, it's the National Farmers Federation, isn't it? It's all you pesky farmers.
Yeah, well, I mean, bring on more cafes that have smashed avo and bring on more wine bars and bring more dinner parties on, because that's good for our farmers. And any business that isn't in tune with what their customers are asking for will go out of business.
So you're not seeing you're not buying into the climate politics of division, which some people have described this as, that there's real Australians out in the bush and then there's these people in the... Have you ever been to a wine bar? I've never been to a wine bar.
Oh, I think we might leave that for another time. I'm not going to dob myself in.
Wine bar.
Of course I've been to a wine bar. I support our Australian producers.
Do they have food there?
Oh, they have finger food, good Australian finger food. And, you know, might some...
See, that's very important that you didn't say tapas then, you see.
Well, there you go.
See, you got the rare, you see? And that's the difference between you two, isn't it?
Look, the difference here, and the important part is that the farmers are already there, right? So bring it on. We're not fearful of the targets. In fact, most of the commodities and the sectors or the organisation that represent those commodities have already set those targets, and it's already happening.
So who's he talking to?
Well, I think it might be to, I guess, their base or those that maybe are providing some resistance. But
who is that? Who's that?
Well, I don't know who that target was, whether it's those internally or those that don't.
You mean
want
behind
the
him on the back bench?
Potentially, but it's not targeted at our farmers because we're already there, and our universities are working on how we do this as a sector through research. We're doing that at Charles Sturt University. And as I said, there's no fear amongst the farmers throughout the bush that we can't do this. In fact, we're almost asking for it so that we get some certainty. Where are the rules and the guidelines? And the other thing is we work in a global market, particularly in agriculture. So we don't want to actually be kept out of some trade deals because we've got a different set of rules here in Australia that our consumers on the other side of the world have. And, you know, if we're going into the UK to talk about a trade deal after Brexit, I'd hate for us to get pipped at the post by New Zealand because we don't have the same terms that then they can validate to their customers that what they're supplying through their supermarkets and their food and fibre and their wine there doesn't have the same sort of things that the consumers are looking for. So if they're looking for it here, the lefties in Sydney, doesn't matter if they're in London or they're in New York, people are interested about this. They want to know that ag is playing its part and it's got all the solutions.
Okay, well, put your Climate Council hat on, Nikki. I mean, Niall's a professor of food sustainability, so you expect him to say that. The National Farmers Federation would have no issue with what he's saying, but members of the National Party, federally, parliamentarians, would have an issue with what he's saying, wouldn't they? Is that who the Prime Minister's talking to?
Well, I think it is, and I think it's also partly the coal lobby. I mean, there seems to be this big divide around, you know, we must preserve coal jobs at all costs, and if we're not going to preserve those, then let's put our energy into no pun intended, into gas related jobs, which is completely the wrong way of looking at it. Australia has had lots of structural changes in its economy over decades. You know, we used to have a bit more of a manufacturing sector. Actually investing in a clean industrial revolution would actually give us more manufacturing jobs. It would bring back a broader base to the economy. And while I don't want to see any individual have to lose their job, if we plan for this, the Prime Minister recently has been saying we've got all this training on offer. Well, put the same sorts of training on offer on the table for people to move from coal to renewables. And coal is in any way going down the automation pathway, and there will be fewer and fewer jobs. No one sector of the economy can claim to have a right to their jobs existing at the expense of the entire nation. And those jobs, as Niall said, those jobs will go because the rest of the world is moving in a completely different direction. So for us to ignore the reality of what the rest of the world is claiming for and to ignore the fantastic economic opportunities, if we are moving fast in investing in these green and clean spaces, it's about getting the research now and backing that. We don't have to, I don't think anyone's talking about an emissions trading scheme again. That's gone by the by. Even Ross Garner's given up on that one, and he was the one that thought about it.
So we just roll downhill with the momentum from the agriculture lobby, with the fact, now I've looked this statistic up, so I'll bore you with it, that apparently Australia last year, while we were all baking bread through COVID, we were also ringing up to get solar panels on the roof. So Australia, the Netherlands, Norway deployed new renewables per capita at 10 times the global rate in 2020, and Australia 3 times faster than the US and China. So is the Prime Minister right? A bit of ingenuity and we'll just get there.
Well, we can't, because just think about something like hydrogen, okay? That is the most prospective technology, green hydrogen, but we're still quite a way behind in the research. You think of the money and the resources that were thrown at developing a COVID vaccine because we saw how urgent it was. If we treated other renewable energies, because essentially the fossil fuel sector, I mean, ag is doing its place, the building sector is doing its place, transport has the opportunity to move to electric.
So we'll get there.
So no, because we need to have more support. We need to have clarity around what the goals are, when they're going to be implemented. We need a pathway, and we do need some government support for whether it's R&D, whether it's investment incentives, but we need to actually make sure that we have very clear goalposts and all the supports. You cannot do it without the federal government.
And taxes in the rearview mirror. That horse is bolted. Don't worry about that.
Or incentives might be the way to go. I mean, this is about transition as much as anything, and that's what a target does. It helps the whole economy transition, and those that don't have the capacity to be early adopters, they get to be swept up and supported along the way.
Sam, thanks for joining us. Sorry, we had a few technical glitches at the top of the show, I think, or something. Tell me, you have wheeled into Parliament House lots of times to talk to people about complex policy development. You know, is it ever possible in your mind that these sorts of things can get done without government? They can just sort of get done with the goodwill and the determination of the non-government sector?
I'd love to say yes. I think the bigger the issue is, the more people need to be involved, you know, and really if you're looking at an issue of this kind of scale, which is something that is everyone's responsibility, you know, it's local, national, international, that we all should be part of this. But government, you know, we have an international agreement. We have, we really should be signing up for 2030 in my view, you know. I want to see my grandchildren not fry. And, you know, so I think in terms of policy development, really, this should be something led by government with the sector.
Rick Morton, why is the Prime Minister giving this keynote speech at this time?
Well, he really doesn't have much choice left. He's been left embarrassed by global world leadership, particularly those from our major ally in the United States and also China, our major trading partner. So, you know, we have kind of abdicated responsibility for this issue for so long in Australia. And, you know, the original kind of mistruth about all of this is that it could have been avoided, or that we could just keep stalling on climate change and the issue would eventually go away. That was never going to happen. Industries like coal were always going to close. It's only a matter of when. And so every instance of obfuscation and stalling from people who are meant to be in charge becomes a major contributor to the problem when those people do actually have to get out of that industry. And now we could have been working, as Nikki said, on all of these technology solutions. In fact, we were. We had great, manufacturing capability and research going on into renewable technology, and we left. We gave it up to other world powers, including China. So this is really, as you said, it's inching towards the bare minimum from the Prime Minister, because right now it's not just about the fact of, you know, whether we will kind of experience more natural disasters and more intense natural disasters, because that's already happening, but it's about the economy. I mean, because we will get left behind, and it's on our doorstep right now.
I don't understand the politics of this, Niall. I mean, everybody's talking, and they always do on this program, about the sort of the inevitability of this, and we've dedicated a lot of time to talking about the sorts of structural adjustments over a couple of decades. I don't know, I'm not an expert, that coal communities really need governments to walk with them to develop. So why is the Prime Minister so incremental? As quickly as possible, preferably by 2050, increasing in confidence that we're developing a plan to achieve. Why is it so incremental?
It's probably just a bit of a play each way.
But why?
Well, I think that there's probably two different stakeholders that he also needs to manage. It's his colleagues and the views that they have and the people that they may represent, or the industries that they represent. And then it's also those that are going to take this issue in mind when they go to the ballot box. So, look, I think this is it's definitely a step in the right direction. This is as good as we've seen to date, moving in this area, but I think it's a play or a bet each way.
Look, I just want to take you back to the attitudes of the agricultural sector to this. I was saying before about the levels of take-up of solar panels, and that's right across Australia as well, isn't it? I mean, there's significant interest in off-grid renewables in the bush. We've got hydrogen-powered tractors coming online. We've got the NFF wanting to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and the red meat sector wanting to get to it by 2030, all because they want to supercharge agriculture and they know they can't supercharge emissions. So what sorts of things are you working on that are going to enable us to provide food and fibre to the world without having the emissions go through the roof?
Well, I mean, firstly, I find it's quite funny to think that farmers wouldn't be embracing renewable technology. I mean, the quintessential picture of the Australian farm involves a windmill, and that's been around for decades or even, you know, over 100 years. So farmers will utilise what they can to help their production, and that might be the sun, the wind, or it might be small grid pumped hydro and things like that as well. What we're doing in the sector, particularly through research, we're working with farmers and also the consumers through the food companies to look at how they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions on farm. We have a project called the Cool Soil Initiative. We're working with lots of farmers to try and drive down their greenhouse gas emissions to produce grain that then they can supply into the food chain that has a better footprint. So whether that's reducing the types of inputs that are going to emit greenhouse gas emissions. We're working with them on their systems, but also looking at the types of ways of farming, whether it's in regenerative farming, and there's other areas of research in that space, to try and actually have a better footprint. The use of new technology, the use of genetics, a whole range of things, the feeding of things like of seaweed to reduce methane emissions coming from livestock.
Say what you mean, farts and birds.
This is all what we're doing. I mean, there's no lack of goodwill, good research or actual practical applications that aren't already happening in the ag space.
And just finally, because we're going to move on, but how much enthusiasm is there in the bush to tap into new income from hosting large-scale renewables on farms, be they wind turbines, solar arrays, whatever, so that when there is a drought, when there is a flood, there's still income coming in?
There is a whole range of new incomes that are going to be available for our land stewards into the future through carbon markets, through biodiversity offsets, through renewable energy projects.
And this is not just you being a pointy-headed professor, this is stuff that's being talked about.
You go and speak to the banks that are investing in farming operations. They're all looking at these new economies and markets of the future. The world is the oyster for our farmers. That's why we're not afraid of this. We want to embrace it. So let's support it, put some structure around it, get the effort all consolidated heading into the one direction as a country. Don't worry about states, don't worry about different sectors. Let's work together because there's so many opportunities for our farmers here.
The trans-Tasman bubble has been open for just a day, but there's already been high drama at Auckland Airport. A fully vaccinated worker tested positive today. However, the source of the infection is unlikely to be a recent flight from Australia. Despite the new case, Jacinda Ardern is confident the travel bubble won't burst.
When we opened on both sides, we of course knew that we would continue to have cases connected to our border. In fact, when we announced the date for opening the trans-Tasman bubble, Queensland was dealing with cases linked to its border. So we accept that's going to be part of our journey together. I think Australia accepts that. And for both sides, we're always looking for clear connection to the border. In this case, there is.
So while New Zealand will continue to be quarantine-free, there's also a glimmer of hope for the 36,000 Australians still stranded elsewhere around the world. Last week, a UN Human Rights Committee called on the Australian government to facilitate and ensure the prompt return of 2 Australians. Stephanie Bolci explains.
The trans-Tasman travel bubble is good to go, but the Prime Minister says it's one step at a time.
Australia is in no hurry to open those borders, can I assure you.
It's been more than a year since Australia imposed hotel quarantine for returning residents, limiting the number of people allowed to board flights back to Australia. While weekly caps have risen across the states this year, the government says 36,000 still want to come home, with nearly 5,000 considered vulnerable. Those wanting to return say they've been hampered by cancelled flights and unaffordable options, which they say is a direct result of the quarantine system.
Technically, the border's not closed, we all know that, but practically it is.
Expats like Jason George have been gathering online.
We've tried. The flights are ridiculously expensive, and we've in fact had flights cancelled on us with no alternative proposed.
He's one of the 2 claimants in test cases before the UN's Human Rights Committee. They're being represented by Jeffrey Robertson QC, claiming the government breached an article of the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that no one should be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter. While they await their case, the UN says they must be promptly returned to Australia.
Effectively, Australia, I guess, can choose not to follow through with the recommendations that come from the committee. I think the optics here become important, though, because if effectively they are publicly being told by the international community that they're breaking international law in this regard, and they are not prepared to take any action on that and are prepared to leave their citizens outside of Australia, I'm not sure it's such a great message.
The claim is being supported by advocacy group Free and Open Australia, which hopes other people will join the fight.
It looks as though we've won the case, so to speak. The UN has said that they want an immediate repatriation for the 2 gentlemen and their families, and the government have been very silent on the Australian front.
The Prime Minister has already flagged that it could be towards the end of the year until anything major changes for vaccinated returning Aussies.
We need to have a balance in how we're going to bring Australians home, because obviously we don't want to bring anything back that's going to affect the community as a whole.
Deb returned from India on a DFAT flight and quarantined in the Northern Territory's Howard Springs. After her experience, she's keen to see that facility expanded.
It is gold star.
A government spokesperson told The Drum they are confident the inward travel restrictions are consistent with international legal obligations. Nikki, let's start with you. You have a daughter in Japan. Would you like her to come home?
I would really like her to come home. I'm not sure she's so keen, but her visa is up in August. So she's looking now at, well, how do I get home? The flights are crazy. If you can even get one, they're so incredibly expensive.
How much are we talking?
Oh, I think she was looking at $9,000. So it's, you know, I mean, you can find things cheaper on the internet, but they're not real. So if you sort of dial up Webjet, it'll tell you can get a flight for $700, you know, if you want to lay over in somewhere for 7 days on the way and whatever. So it's not even the expense, it's actually the flights, getting a flight itself. So, I mean, obviously, and it's not just that she can't come home, it's that we haven't seen her for well over a year, and it's, you know, I mean, I feel sympathy for everybody who's got family and friends living abroad. We're all going through this, but we have to find a way that when people are ready to come home, for them to come home now. And I understand, I mean, I think that's right. We have to obviously weigh the health risks up. But surely, where there's a will, there's a way. Surely it is not beyond the capability of this country to run a reasonable quarantine centre. I have a young friend who came back from London who did pay around £7,000, I think, for his airfare to get back in time for a job. He was lucky to get on one at all, but he was at the Darwin facility and said it was quite good. Not enough food, but it was a young lady.
Yes,
but it was
food.
You know, but it was good. So why can't we do more of this? I just can't believe it's beyond our comprehension to be able to run something that works well.
Sam, it's interesting. I mean, you're steeped in the language and understanding of rights in your work as an advocate. And so, you know, these folks are talking about that there is an international right. People have a right under UN conventions to return to their country of which they're a citizen. But you also represent people who'd be pretty vulnerable if they came home and brought the virus into the community.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of that double-edged thing. We've got friends who are in England, but they can get a vaccine at the moment,
Yeah,
so
right.
they're arguably better off at the moment. But those 5,000 vulnerable people, you think about people who are separated by distance and they have ageing parents or, you know, people with disability who might be in England who are at risk and hugely more at risk when they wouldn't be in Australia. You know, it's a massive issue. But there is a right under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which is about not just citizenship but being able to travel freely.
Yeah, yeah. Just while we're talking about vaccine, just on a slightly tangential issue, I noticed today that Labor's Katie Gallagher was commenting on the fact that only 6.5% of disability care residents have received the vaccine, and they'd be in the highest, they'd be in 1A and 1B, wouldn't they? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, it's been wild. There's been an issue, I think, around assumptions, you know, so the people who are in residential care were supposed to be in the front line. I think there was an assumption by people that people were just able to have the support from the NDIS or from their providers to be able to go out and to get them when a lot of people are still locked down in those residential places.
Because of the risk of COVID?
Because of the risk of COVID, but also because it hasn't been on offer. Whereas in the nursing homes, they had people coming around to the nursing homes and delivering it. And so I think there was a lot more aged care delivery done. So their numbers are quite stark, and there's a lot of people who are very vulnerable and at risk living in the community who aren't entitled to being in the front line when our workers are, which is a bit hilarious.
I see. And so was part of the issue, just to stay on this tangent for a moment, that there are more people likely to be congregated in aged care, and so it's easier to send a team of people in there and get a group vaccinated, whereas people in disability accommodation are likely to be in smaller groups. Is that it?
I don't think it's specifically the issue because there are smaller groups, but there are still large congregate places and, places like hospitals, which are C-class hospitals and that kind of thing, hostels, boarding houses. So when you're looking at residential accommodation, it means a whole range of things, I really think it's a cultural thing about the divide between health and disability and aged care and how, we interact with it. I know that David Moody from NDIS was out there advocating very strongly, but hopefully they can remedy that within the next few weeks and make sure that everyone's protected.
You're watching The Drum. With me on the panel, Professor of Food Sustainability at Charles Sturt University and former New South Wales Nationals Minister NIALL BLAIR, economics consultant at Social Outcomes, a for-purpose enterprise, and the Climate Council, NICKI HUTLEY. In Melbourne, senior reporter at the Saturday paper, Rick Morton, and in Perth, President of People with Disability Australia, Sam Connor. Last month on this program, we were talking about a plan to introduce compulsory independent assessments on the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Under the pilot program, participants' funding needs were assessed by contractors employed by the government instead of their own specialists. It was a process variously described as confronting and demeaning.
It takes about 3 hours, and the questions are very repetitive. They're very personal. One example is that I just met this person, and they asked me about whether I need support to have sex, and I'm not entirely sure why I'm being asked that question. But when I was asked it, and as I was answering it, I was explaining that I did need help, and I felt quite ashamed. And I know that's wrong. But I felt quite embarrassed.
Well, I'm just outraged about this. I think it's unnecessary and increasingly inappropriate. Each time we hear more about it, it gets worse.
Facing an enormous backlash, the independent assessment plan has now been paused by Linda Reynolds, who's just taken up the job as Minister for Government Services. But that's far from the last existential threat facing the NDIS. Last week, our panellist Rick Morton got hold of a leaked internal memo showing that the NDIS had set up a secretive task force that's been instructed to avoid budget overrun by cutting access to the scheme and the level of funding for participants.
The actions of the SAT will make immediate changes to slow growth in participant numbers, slow growth in spend per participant, and strengthen operational discipline. We need to act now to ensure that we can deliver a better NDIS.
Rick, a better NDIS. Tell me, is there a stealth campaign to cut the budget or cut the spending of the NDIS, cut the promise of the NDIS?
Yes, there is, and it's actually been happening for years now. And all of the pieces had to be slowly put in place by successive ministers. Christian Porter, Stuart Robert, Linda Reynolds has now inherited the portfolio. But there has been a massive change in the culture within the National Disability Insurance Agency. But there has always been one constant, which is the scheme actuary, who has vast amounts of control over the numbers in this scheme and the tools in which they can clamp down on them. And with the political will, particularly of Stuart Robert, they have kind of pushed all of their pieces into play almost at once. And when you get a hold of that leaked draft legislation with the comments from senior officials within the agency, it's almost like they were at the smorgasbord and they asked for everything they wanted, which was every kind of element of control you could possibly imagine within this scheme. And they got caught out. And now they're kind of rushing back to the barricades. But, the headline is that Linda Reynolds has pushed pause on the independent assessments. That's she had to say that because she's the new minister. But, in a memo the next day, which was also leaked to me by the CEO of the NDIA, Martin Hoffman, he says that, he's spoken to Linda Reynolds and the government more broadly, and he understands they're broadly committed to their scheme reform and that internally, at least, the agency continues on these reforms and continues the work on them. So they have stalled, but they have not stopped.
Sam, Rick's reporting basically tells us a couple of things, that there's this big restructuring effort to cut down the costs of the agency, including draft legislation to let the federal minister really have what he's described as sort of God powers to do that without having to go back to the states or talk to other stakeholders. So cut down the costs of the agency, limit the number of people who are eligible for funding, who can be participants in the scheme, and limit the amount of money that each participant is eligible for. Now, that was all information that was leaked to him from some hard reporting. Does that marry up with what people are telling you in terms of the outcomes they're getting from their assessments?
Absolutely. You know, there's a very prominent disabled Australian who's had his funding cut by 80% on the back of a recent independent assessment. People haven't got their plans back. They've had the assessment and they're still waiting. We've seen some of the assessments that have come through that are just shocking. They're being done by strangers in people's homes in 20 minutes. None of this is new. I mean, in 2015, they shoved 270,000 Australians onto New Start from the GSP. So it's through exactly the same methodology. Yeah, through independent assessments. So we've seen this before, and nothing's new. The new thing is that the scheme wasn't working particularly well. We were hoping for it to change and gave, significant feedback, and did not expect, cuts to be made, for it to be narrowed and capped, and for the scheme to be endangered itself.
Nikki, there genuinely does seem to be a problem from the federal government's point of view, and that is that they get an annual growth, and I'm indebted to Rick for this information from his reporting, an annual growth in 4% of the amount of the budget that's contributed by the states and territories, but they're forecasting, they haven't had it yet, they're forecasting that they're going to have a 23% increase in costs in future years. So, I mean, how are they supposed to deal with this?
Well, there's always been a mismatch between the number of people who have a disability and the type of disability and those that are actually included in the NDIS. And it comes down to, this is all about economics or finance. It's not about what the needs of people with a disability are. And I have a certain sympathy, because there is a finite resources. We don't have endless budgets. But it seems to me that we've lost perspective of what the NDIS is actually trying to achieve.
But can you understand, I mean, you've worked for Treasury in the dim, dark past. Can you understand the mindset of just looking at the numbers and going, we can't have that growth in the cost of this scheme?
Well, no, because that's not what the scheme is about. That's solving problem A with solution B instead of matching them up. What you need to say is, right, we have much faster growth. And this was always going to be the case. It was always thought that they'd underestimate the number of people who were going to require services, and underestimated how many people could provide those services, or the products that were needed to support people with a disability. So it's a very simple equation. It's like, what do we need to make this system work to the best of our ability? How much are we prepared to fund it? What is the source of that funding? I mean, it's called insurance, but it's not like everybody's paying in a certain amount. Like they sometimes in other countries have more similar insurance schemes where you are paying a premium. We're just saying this comes out of general revenue. I mean, we have to think about how we want to fund this and what it is we want to fund. But just saying, whoops, we made a mistake, let's just cut the funding and slow down the process. How is that good policy outcome for anybody?
Can I make a point there, Ellen, as well, about the history here? Because the government has known.
We'll go to Rick and we'll come straight back to you, Sam.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
You're right.
The government has known that this is coming for a very long time. I mean, I've been reporting since 2013 that the numbers were undercooked, and they had early experience along those lines. And they were quite happy when there was an underspend in the scheme to book that money to the budget, to the balance sheet, to make the government look better. But of course, as soon as there's an overrun, they do what they've done with Robodebt and with other compliance programs in the government, which is outsource the government's responsibility to, make the program right, and to make it somehow a problem for people with disabilities, as if they were the ones that stuffed up. And that was never the case. Every single person who has gained access to the NDIS or who has a support package under the NDIS is there because the legislation allows them to be there and they deserve the support. What is happening at the moment is that the agency has taken it upon itself to be some kind of quasi-political body to redesign the scheme on behalf of the ministers who decide that they don't want to deal with the problem, which the way it should be dealt with is through COAG with the states and territories, and none of that process has happened.
Sam, Budget 2020 provided billions of dollars more for the NDIS. Where is the money going?
So in the last election was won on the back of a $4.2 billion underspend was the line that was promoted at the time. So people generally don't spend their entire package. There's huge waiting lists for people. When people talk about disparity between town to city, some of that's about thin markets as well, that we don't have the workforce out there, that kind of thing. So we haven't actually seen any of these figures. The actuary became an outsourced person and an independent consultant, so you can't FOA any of that.
So you're not persuaded by this 23% increase in costs that they reckon is coming down? You think they're reacting to something that hasn't happened, you're not convinced will happen?
Well, I think there's been a whole raft of things that are happening under the Digital Transformation Agency with data and some guinea pig projects and blockchaining. A lot of that has happened. There's been a system rebuild. There's been huge amounts of consultants. There's, armies walking through the corridors of the NDIA of men in grey suits from, McKinsey and different organisations all the time. And lawyers who are fighting at AAT. So there's a huge amount of cost involved in the agency's running of the actual agency, which doesn't go to support people with disability. When you look at how much disabled people have got, we run a group with 60,000 people, disabled people, families and service providers, and nobody is saying that they have enough funding for basic things like wheelchairs and personal care. So when we're looking at this, there's not a huge amount of new people who have come into the scheme and are getting more money. We'd really like some transparency around all of this instead of it being run under the cover of darkness, and to talk to disabled people and enter into a co-design process.
Well, 6% of NDIS participants need to be transitioned out of institutional care into modern, purpose-built specialist disability accommodation. About 28,000 participants, including young people who may have suffered a stroke or other brain injury, are languishing in residential aged care because there's no other suitable housing for them. The Aged Care Royal Commission recommended that by 2025, no one under the age of 65 should be in these facilities if they don't want to be, and the government is committed to this. To meet those targets, specialist disability housing is already being built by investors. But how about this for what looks like a bureaucratic bungle? Investors have ploughed the money in. There are residents anxious to move into these houses, but in case after case after case, the NDIS is denying funding for participants to take up the accommodation, and many units are sitting empty. The Drum's Stephanie Bolchi has been looking into this.
At 51, Trina currently lives in a specialist share house, subsidised by the NDIS, but has been waiting for her own property.
There's a unit that was set aside with my name on it, and it's not just across the road, it's literally across the driveway.
Before Trina had a stroke, she was a successful scientist, heading her own lab.
The neurologist did say that it was lucky I had such a big brain because it could have done a lot more damage. I just thought I'd slip that in there. Big brain.
With nowhere to go, she initially ended up in aged care.
My mental state and emotional state took a dive, along with my physical.
So when she was offered this 3-bedroom share house in 2015, Trina says it was like winning the lottery.
It was just amazing rolling into this beautiful home filled with light, filled with space, being on a normal street in a community without being too overdramatic. I think it really saved my life.
But she says to thrive, she needs to move. With
the brain injury, I find that I need my own space to be productive. I need to know that if I put something down somewhere, it's going to be there when I need it. I am very aware that it is a share house and most of the house is for all the residents to use.
Advocates claim that a trend has emerged in NDIS decision-making. People with disability have had their applications for independent living or living to a residence knocked back, being told instead that they must live in groups of 3.
I was gutted when I found out that the NDIS would not support me living by myself. They didn't give any reasons, and it sounds like it's been happening a lot.
And it came to light that the panel never reviewed that application, only when it was flagged that she has a tenancy offer to live alone. I'm not sure why they haven't approved it. She's exerting choice and control, and it seems reasonable.
There's another impact too. With the NDIS apparently changing the ground rules, it's scaring off the investors, developers and their financiers who are lining up to build the specialist disability housing that's so desperately needed.
In my own space, I would be able to do that much better than in a shared space. It's going to inhibit my physical development, my aim to get more mobile, more able, and to get back out into the workforce and pay taxes to support other people.
It's interesting, isn't it, Niall? You've got the investors, the for-purpose investment, and they've built the wrong thing because the rules changed and nobody only because of Rick's reporting do we know that the rules have changed. I mean, that seems to go against all Liberal Party philosophy that the government sets the broad rules and then doesn't get in the way of private sector initiative.
Well, private sector needs certainty to be able to invest. I mean, if they see that it's the rules are going to change halfway through, then of course investors won't go into that. And I think that's just an example of how we need to make sure that programs like the NDIS are person-centred, around the person that needs that support. And even Nikki and I were talking earlier before we came on, and I mean, the question that's always stuck in my mind is, why is it called an insurance scheme rather than an assurance scheme? Because to me, I think it should be the safety net to provide that person-centred resource and services to make sure that everyone in our community, particularly those with a disability, can have the quality of life and make a contribution that they want to. They untap their potential.
Mm. Sam, YOUNGCARE, which is the organisation that is building specialist disability accommodation for young people to get people out of residential aged care, say that, about Christmas, these assessments started coming back, and people that they thought were absolutely assured of getting independent living or with one other person, suddenly it came back 3 to 1, and all the investors have built the wrong thing. Do you start hearing that around Christmas?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also issues around the type of dwelling that they're building in their terms. They say they have robust houses, which are for people who have got higher support needs and need more accessibility and, unbreakable things. They cost a lot more money. So those people, there's more of that group of people waiting to go into those houses, and because they cost more, there's less of those houses and more of the other type that there aren't as many people being approved. So, as the scheme, as the NDIA cut the number of people's ability to get into them, people generally don't want to live in an institution, even a small one. So 3 to 5 people is still a small institution, and they're calling them forever homes, which I find particularly distasteful. Do you want to go and live with 4 other strangers for the rest of your life? Generally not.
And just explain for people what that means. If you have complex care needs, if you can't regulate your body temperature, if you need therapy and care that can't be delivered in your room, what does it mean for an adult person to have to share with 2 other people rather than live individually or just with one other? Just explain that.
Well, historically we've had, shared care. So we have SDA providers at the moment who are the people who are providing the housing, and then we have a provider who provides the care and support. Quite often they're both, so you've got an SDA provider who also provides care and support. What does that look like when it goes pear-shaped with your support? You can't get rid of them because they're your landlord as well, you know. That's the sort of issue that we have, and they're the sorts of issues that we've had traditionally. Shared care has looked like, you know, big groups of disabled people getting on a big white bus to go to bowling every Thursday, and that's your one outing per week, you know. We fought very hard for individualised funding for, you know, people to be able to just go see a doctor, to just have therapy, to have individualised supports and to be able to have their rights upheld, which Article 19 is that we can live with who we want and where we want, in the way that we want with the support that we need, which is reasonable and fair. You know, that's something where we're just being told we're going to be shoved back into institutions at the moment. We need to make sure that we take a really hard line on segregation and isolation and make sure we uphold people's rights to live in the way they need to.
The cornerstone of the NDIS was choice and control, Rick. That was the catch cry of the NDIS. Can you understand why an adult person who can't regulate their body temperature might not want to strip down to their undies and have to sit in the middle of a lounge room with two other people, or, you know, have their needs met in front of other people, two other people, rather than just one? That this is a big issue?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I can understand why I wouldn't want to do that. I mean, I live alone and I like living alone. And that's a choice I get to make. And people with disabilities should be able to make those choices for themselves. I mean, part of the issue here is, as Sam was describing, you've got specialist disability accommodation for the people who build the houses. And then the NDIS funds what they call supported independent living, which is the care and support that is meant to be there to help you live on your own in the community. Now, you know, I think I was writing about this at the end of last year or at the very beginning of this year. The NDIA just started going through people with supported independent living packages. And in one case, I spoke to a provider in Victoria. They lost, you know, they had about 45 clients and almost all of them were reassessed. And suddenly they stopped getting a package for complex care and they were downgraded to just high care. Now, nothing about their circumstances had changed, not a single thing. And what happened was the agency just secretly got rid of a category, an entire category for that support called complex care. And they're doing this without telling people. That was something that I had to figure out based on a provider going, this is a bit weird because it's not there anymore. And yet publicly on their website, there's no mention of it. And I understand from discussions with people who still work at the agency that there is even more coming down the pike in terms of changes to what we call supported independent living. And again, that's not public information. You know, why are they not communicating this stuff? And I think I know the answer to that. It's because they know that what they're doing is not in keeping with the original aim of the NDIS. It's not about choice. It's about the agency's control.
But Sam, if government came to you in a transparent way, and think about this, Noel, because you can join in on this one. But first, Sam, and said, look, we know that the promise of the scheme was choice and control. We know that we were going to put the person at the centre of it, but the Commonwealth's on the hook for cost overruns, and we have to put some limits on this. We need to sit down with you and have that conversation. Would you engage with the government on that? That's hard to do, isn't it?
That would have been nice in about 2018. It would have been great.
Would it though? Would it?
Yeah, absolutely, because disabled people are the people who can actually save money better than any other people can. You know, the cost of unnecessary assessments and therapy that, you know, people don't necessarily choose, or having to evidence something with really expensive, you know, occupational therapist report that are 10 times the cost of the item that you're fighting for. Like, this is ludicrous. You know, when people have got the choice to actually buy their own support, and, you know, we're doing that. We don't actually get money. We actually, you know, do this through a process. But when people are making direct choices with information, with good peer support, that's when the cost savings actually come in. And so, you know, really all we're asking is just the basic support that we need to live a decent life, like an ordinary life like everybody else, and to have our rights upheld. If you live in a group home in a congregate setting, you're not going to be able to bring your date home. You're not going to be able to start a family. You can't have a pet in most cases. You know, you can't live an ordinary life. You're living a disabled life. And, you know, this is just what we're fighting for, that basic needs.
And Noel, what accounts for that reluctance to say, we've got a problem with a scheme that resulted from this extraordinary grassroots effort by people with a disability in Australia and their advocates. They came up with it. The politicians didn't. The think tanks didn't. The bureaucrats didn't. They came up with it and they backed those bloody politicians into a corner until they did it. And Sam was one of the ones who did it. To just turn around and say, forget the consultants. Let's just talk to the people who are the participants here. What's with that?
Well, I don't know what the reluctance is. To me, that would be the best policy implementation framework that you would look to speak to those that are actually affected by the decisions and the funding that you actually got into the area. And, you know, we know that the federal government, for example, is furthest away from those that are actually the ones that are going to have the interface with these services. So, you know, it should be then almost a given that they would want to speak to those that are actually going to be affected by this more rather than less. Unfortunately, we get this disconnect between those that are tasked with, I guess, making sure they deliver, and usually a catch-crying government is on time, on budget, right? And then a lot of the other things start to go out the window. So, look, I don't know what's stopping it. I don't know whether it's pride or whether it's just the fact they need to roll these things out. But a system like this, I mean, I can relate the same with farming. I mean, you know, you've got to actually speak to the people. I use the analogy, you know, it's one thing to watch traffic and it's another thing to sit in traffic, right? You get a different feel, different frustrations, and you can miss many things if you're just there watching traffic go by. Something happens down the road. So, you know, good policy implementation continues to engage and consult with the stakeholders that are actually affected by this, regular feedback, and then have the agility and also, I guess, the courage to maybe make changes along the way. And I think in governments, quite often we see that lack of courage to maybe sometimes put their hand up and say, look, we maybe have got this wrong or we need to change tact here. The reluctance a lot of the time in that space is because we're always looking to point the finger at someone if something has gone wrong or it has slipped. But in a space like this, I tell you what, it's too important to get wrong. This is one where I think that engagement and that consultation is imperative.
Yeah, I'm being told to move on, Sam, but just give me a final word on this. I mean, this has been pots and pans politics all the way is what I call it. It's when ordinary people get out and they they bang, under the Gillard government, they banged the pots, didn't they? And they smashed the pot lids together. Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can, sorry.
How do you feel about having to keep fighting all this way?
We're exhausted. You know, we've, somebody texted me just before we came in and said, you know, the NDIA are no longer going to fund generators, and two of our friends from my community, from the muscular dystrophy community, died in Perth in a storm. They had muscular dystrophy and there was a failure of a generator, and, you know, these two young men died who had Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So it's really personal for us, and the thing that we pushed about this is that, you know, the fight for the scheme was called Every Australian Counts, and it's not just for us, it's like Medicare, so it's for all of you as well. So if you do break your neck, you're not going to be left, you know, languishing in a hospital somewhere, and that you're going to be able to go back to work, that you're going to be able to take your kids to the footy, that kind of thing. So we're really not asking for anything more. We're all really, really tired. We just wish that we could sit down and have a decent conversation and halt the independent assessments now, the pilot, and make sure that we get this right.
So much more in your reporting we didn't get to tonight, Rick, but thank you very much for all that work that you've done and for your expertise, Sam, on this.
If anyone in the agency still wants to contact me, my details are on my website.
Even though the head of the agency keeps telling them to stop, and you got that email within moments of him sending it to them.
Yes, and that's an indicator of low morale, I think, in the agency.
Yeah. Finally tonight, Australia Post is on the nose in many rural and regional areas today after announcing they'll no longer deliver perishable items such as butter, cheese, truffles and small goods from June 30. The taxpayer-owned business says they made the decision because of the complex food and safety requirements differing across states and territories, but producers of gourmet goods say the decision could ruin them. Rhiannon Druce is the General Manager of JUNEE Licorice and Chocolate Factory at the New South Wales Riverina, which dispatches up to 10,000 parcels in Australia every year. She says it's not clear if the ban will apply to them.
We produce organic licorice, organic raspberry licorice. We chocolate coat licorice, chocolate coated raspberry, almonds, macadamias, hazelnuts, freeze-dried strawberries, sultanas, cranberries. Then we make Rocky Road. We make giant pizza wheels, which are just absolutely delicious. We make a lot of very visually appealing, delicious things. As COVID has progressed and domestic travel kind of decreased last year, we really rebranded our business model to increase our online profile. I can see the health concerns for things that can perish, I suppose, if you want to use that word, but it should be up to that company to have that risk put on them, and packaging it correctly with insulation and cooling gel packs and things like that, which all companies are very, very versed in knowing how to do and successfully do. So far, all we've been told is that we're a category 2 in perishable items. So a category 1 is those things like meats and cheeses. So we're basically just asking for a little bit more of a definition surrounding what is going to be on that list of perishable items that are prohibited in freight, and whether we're going to be a part of that, because being a rural business, we don't really have many other options. We don't have the luxury of being metro where you can kind of just switch to a competitor.
I know, you're sitting there shaking your head, but you were the Food Safety Minister, so presumably you have to take these things seriously.
Oh, absolutely. Food safety is imperative, and most food businesses know that. But this is certainly something that Australia Post has dropped the ball on and really, really poorly communicated to their consumers. They would have known what was coming down the pipeline in relation to e-commerce, the fact that we're all moving towards wanting to be closer to the producers of our food. COVID, we've seen the numbers. Australia Post is a data company. They could tell you what was happening every day of the week at every second and who's sending what where. So this is a pretty poor cop-out, I think. We know that we need a good e-commerce delivery partner, particularly in regional communities. I mean, this has been the lifeline to some of our farming and food businesses in the regions coming off the back of drought, bushfires, COVID. We've been having government-led campaigns saying buy from the bush, and now we've got Australia Post saying, yeah, but you'll have to drive it yourself or invest in a truck. We can do better than this.
Nearly out of time, Nikki. It's the Federation, it's complicated, there are different rules. You just can't help this.
I think this is probably more an issue of Australia being highly urbanised, and yet we've got scattered communities where the cost of providing some of these services, because ultimately if you had a good market system there, there's clearly demand for these products to be out, so you should be able to get another company come in there and provide the service. But obviously when it's a regional service and you're scattering to the winds, I'm sure there will be an opportunity for places like Junee Chocolate to still deliver to cities, because they'll be able to send large amounts there. But ultimately the economics of our regions is very, very difficult in all sorts of ways, not just in delivering that incredibly delicious looking chocolate.
It looks rather good, doesn't it? We've got about 10 seconds left. Rick, I just imagined when I heard this story that there was a postal union meeting and there was a bloke called Trev who'd accidentally left the blue cheese in the van overnight, and he's quoting the movie Kenny. There's a smell out here that outlasts religion. That's it, we're done. Do you reckon that's what happened?
I probably. I mean, there's always a guy called Trev at the core of most policy issues, I think.
That is all we have time for. Thanks so much to our panel, to NIALL, Nikki, Rick Morton and Sam Connor. Thanks for being in. Sam, have a great evening, and I'll be back with you tomorrow night. Good night.
Whenever you want, wherever you are.